Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 15th of February 2022. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics here. Great to have you on this evening, and thanks for taking some time out of your Tuesday evening. I have Robbie Barwick teed up, ready to come in. Just before I do that, I will just remind you once again that we don't provide specific legal or financial or any other sort of advice, property advice on this channel. It's just a general conversation. Do please play nice in the chat room. We do moderate the stream. This is as at the 15th of February 2022. If you want to get my attention, or if you want to see a question go onto the channel, use @Walk the World. Much greater chance of me seeing it if you do that. I do encourage a lot of conversation on the chat, but I don't necessarily follow all of the streams. And I've also enabled Super Chat, which allows you to get your question top of the list if you'd like to do that, or indeed make a contribution to the running of the show. And with that said, I'm going to bring Robbie in. Robbie, hello there. Whoops, press that button. Try again. Robbie, are you there?
I'm here. How are you, Martin?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. How are you going?
Yeah, good. I've just recovered from a bout of COVID, my first, hopefully my last.
Okay.
And tomorrow we're out of isolation. And
okay.
It wasn't too bad.
Right, okay. Well, you look all right and sound all right, which is good.
Yeah.
I was actually on a five-way conversation this afternoon with a client, and two of the five have had COVID. They were all isolated in various places. So the virtualization continues. But
we're all going to get it.
I think that's probably right. Anyway, look, it's great to have you on. And what I wanted to do tonight was really drill into financial services and the financial services industry and all of the issues around there, right? Because with the election coming up in, probably up May sometime, there are some important policy issues, but also some more strategic issues that need to be thought about around the way that the financial system works or doesn't work, who it serves, who are the winners, who are the losers. And I thought it would be really good to explore some of those issues tonight. So we might touch on, postal banks and things like that, maybe a bit on bail-in. I want to talk about some of the regulatory structures and entities that exist and why they don't work, and we'll go on from there.
Plenty to cover.
Yeah, well, I was going to say enough to cover for quite a long show, but we'll get going. But I guess it will be good just because not everybody may know who you are. So just give the 50-second thumbnail, if you would.
Yeah, I'm the research director of the Australian Citizens Party. We're an independent political party that's 34 years old now. So we're probably the most successful of all the alternative parties. Certainly the most long lasting. A lot of parties rise and fall like flashes in the pan. We haven't. We got re-registered last year, even though they made the registration threshold harder to try and weed out smaller parties. But we're not a small party. We got covered in the financial review last week because of how much money we raise, and how much money we raise reflects actually how much support we have in the community, which you wouldn't know if you went by the media because we're hardly ever reported. But the money we raise doesn't sit in a war chest somewhere because it reflects the money we spend, because we're always fighting campaigns, and your regular viewers would know that, Martin. We don't wait for elections. We will be contesting this election. We've got quite a good slate. We did an election campaign launch last week, which people can go to our website and watch and see our election slate and what we call our fighting platform of 15 priority policies. But you've got to have, you can't wait around for elections. You've got to influence and intervene in the system between elections. And we do that very well. And you've been a great help in that regard, mobilising the Australian people to get involved in the political system. We did a tally at the end of last year. In the last 4 years, we have achieved 6 parliamentary inquiries and had legislation introduced in the Australian Parliament 4 times. That's what this so-called minor party has done the last 4 years, starting with our big bail-in campaign in 2017. So, and we focus. We have views on a lot of different things. Last time you and I talked about Russia and Ukraine, and we can get onto that at the end if we have a bit of time. But if we really
at
want
the
to
end, Robbie, we'll cover everything else.
At the end. But why do we focus on the financial system and why we're going to have this discussion tonight? Because, I mean, the economy is the be-all and end-all, really. The financial system is supposed to serve the real economy, and it doesn't. It's broken. Now, there's still a certain infrastructure that you get to use it, every day, etc. mostly, but don't ever fall foul of it, because you'll be a victim and you won't get any justice from doing that. But more fundamentally, in terms of the financial system facilitating the things that make an economy successful, it actually doesn't do that. And we have to overhaul the whole thing. And a big chunk of it is the banks, but a more important chunk is the government's responsibility, the regulatory system. And we've done a lot of work on exposing the flaws in there. And that's what we should drill down into tonight.
Absolutely. And just to re-emphasize, we think that financial organizations and the financial system is a critical part of the infrastructure of the way economy works, right? But it's who serves who for what purpose. That's the critical question, right? Because at the moment, it's all the wrong way up. In other words, everybody else is subservient to meet the needs of the financial system, and the financial system, it basically generates profit for its shareholders and does very well for itself and for its shareholders, but it is actually essentially pulling value out and sucking people and resources and everything else away from the real economy into this artificially created financial system. The truth is, you've got to turn it around and understand that the financial system should be an enabler of a real economy, real people, real businesses.
Yeah,
and for me, that's where this conversation needs to start, right? So we're not trying to completely write off financial systems and banks, etc., completely. We're saying it's got to be fit for purpose, and the purpose is the end enablement of economic success of a country.
Well, what you've just described, the change, is the essence of neoliberalism. Everything else to do with neoliberalism is by and large a sideshow. That was the essence of it. The financial power that had been kept under certain justified constraints by governments was unrestrained. It was unleashed to be able to serve itself. While the old Labor Party in Australia's history used to call it the money power. And for them it was clear the fight was over who controlled the money power. Do you have a private banking oligopoly which has exclusive control over the money power? Or does the government, because money is powerful, does the government have a role to say, okay, here's the common good that must be served, and we're not going to let this private monopoly control the most powerful means of doing that. We're going to play a role. We're going to use regulation. We're going to use public financial institutions that can also deploy that money power to make sure that it serves the community. And that's the system we had for decades and decades and decades. And in the 70s, neoliberalism came along in the form of Thatcher and Reagan and Hawke and Keating here, Roger Douglas in New Zealand, Rogernomics over there, the Thatcherite revolution, and totally turned that on its head. And they told us, they used all this jargon about how good it was for us. They ridiculed the bureaucrats, and they made government seem so inefficient and so and such a hindrance to our freedoms, etc. And we all fell for it. And they used that jargon and that kind of disinformation to deregulate and privatise, etc. And they had all these promises about how good it would be. And 40 years later, we can assess those promises and appraise it and go, well, that didn't work, right? And once you acknowledge that, then you got to fix it. And that's what our campaign's about.
Yeah, and just to be really clear, the whole idea of letting the market drive everything, right, and the market forces drive everything is bad enough. But when you then tinker with that very market and tilt the playing field. So you don't even have a real market. What you have is the decks stacked in favour of the big guys against everybody else, right? So it's not even like you've got a fair market going on. You have a series of elements that are designed to protect, the 1%, the big finance. And look at the Federal Reserve and what it's doing at the moment, right? Which is basically propping up, the big end of town, right? As it's been doing for the last decade. And whilst they play lip service to the interests of ordinary Americans in the US, or the Reserve Bank says, well, of course we're here for, the prosperity of all Australians. The truth is that by their actions, it's clear that that's not true. What they're doing is perpetuating a particular economic model based on neoliberalism with strategies and policies that are tilted very much to benefit the few. And another example of that, which you see day to day, is the withdrawal of banking services from most regional towns and villages across Australia, right? So if you count the number of branches now compared with where they were, it's gone through the floor, and a lot of people now have difficulty with just accessing banking, right? And of course, the banks say, well, people's going online, you don't need them. But of course, and I know that actually if you take the banking services away from a society, be it a small town or, a village, it then dies. So it's a classic example of you can't just say, well, the market is fine, let the market rip, because one, the market is not fine, and two, it's not a free market in any case, right? So that means you've got to look for points of intervention. And one of the things I think we should talk about, Robbie, up front is the alternative to the banking structure that we've currently got, which of course is, as I say, shrinking. The footprint is shrinking, ATMs are being ripped out, branches are being closed, the servicing hours are being reduced elsewhere, which is, by the way, is not often reported. And that takes us directly then to the Australia Post story and why it is that there is an alternative.
Well, can I start off with some breaking news on that? I would hope that most of your viewers are familiar with the Australia Post scandal in the last 2 years. And of course, our party, and you actually helped a lot as well, Martin, as you know, and your viewers, we intervened in that. We were the only, and this was unique, we were the only people to question what happened. A rich, well-paid Australia Post executive was accused of spending $20,000 on $5,000 Cartier watches for 4 Australia Post, also well-paid Australia Post executives. And by any normal measure of Australian politics, that was unforgivable, right? And she was thrown out on her ear, and no one defended her. And Anthony Morrison did it in a very brutal way, but Anthony Albanese goaded him on and danced on her grave as well, until we started questioning why. And I had a suspicion why, because I knew one bit of information about Christine Holgate, which was that she was a supporter of a postal bank. And I knew the way the banks in Australia work, that alone would be enough to make her enemies in the Liberal government, and certainly among the banks. But then I called up, I saw this newspaper report where the executive director of the Licensed Post Office Group, which represents all the small business people who manage the 2,850 post offices around Australia that are run as small businesses, Angela Cramp. And in this article, Angela Cramp said Christine Holgate was the best CEO Australia Post ever had. And I thought, well, that's pretty unequivocal. How can the best CEO, someone is testifying that she's the best CEO Australia Post ever had, deserve the treatment she got? And when we started asking questions and the story came out, and this is where our party's unique, because every other party ran a mile from it, because you cannot be seen to be defending fat cats handing out gold watches. But we knew there was something else going on. And now the public perception has well and truly turned around. What happened today? Senate estimates is on. Sarah Hanson-Young, the Greens senator who chaired the Australia Post inquiry into the dismissal of Christine Holgate, and did a very good job, in my view. Not, credit where it's due. I don't praise the Greens much, but when they do the right thing, I will. Sarah Hanson-Young chaired that inquiry, and she followed up today with questions to the current executives. And the questions were about retention bonuses that were paid last year. And what was revealed in Senate estimates today is that because the removal of Christine Holgate had set off all this chaos in Australia Post, led to the inquiry, etc. When she finally moved on and took up the job with Global Express, a whole bunch of Australia Post executives started following her out the door. And in order to stop hemorrhaging executives, who, by the way, whose morale the management of Australia Post had destroyed because of what they did to Christine Holgate. The board, the Liberal Party hack stacked on that board, and the chairman, Lucio Di Bartolomeo, who are spineless liars, who said that they would never have approved the watches that she gave, even though they did approve the watches. Lucio wasn't there, but the Liberals on the board did, right? They all backed up Scott Morrison, slimy, spineless liars. They caused this, and they destroyed the morale of the executives, and a whole bunch of them were leaving. So in order to stop the hemorrhage, they approved retention bonuses to keep some on. And 5 of those executives were paid retention bonuses last year. Now, we had got wind of this, and we heard that last year we'd heard that one might have been paid $250,000. What emerged today is that one was paid $500,000. The other 4 were paid lesser amounts, but cumulatively would have been well over $1 million paid in retention bonuses to keep executives at Australia Post so they didn't abandon ship from the chaos the board had caused. And this board approved all those payments. So this came out today thanks to the Greens Senator Sarah Hanson-Young. Did the Labor Party make an issue out of it? No. Where was Kimberley Kitching, the woman who ambushed Christine out of the blue for something that had happened 2 years earlier when she did it in 2020? Not a word. The shadow Labor spokesman tweeted about it, but did she get up in Parliament today in question time and ask the government about why did they approve $1 million in retention bonuses for executives? Not $5,000, $1 million. No. Labor didn't bother asking a question about it. Albo didn't get up there and grandstand about it. And Paul Fletcher and Scott Morrison had nothing to say about it. The whole thing was a goddamn charade to run out of town an executive who was the best executive Australia Post had ever had, but who became an enemy of the banks and who became an absolute obstacle to this plot that the Liberals had to privatise and gut Australia Post. She was an obstacle to that. So if you didn't believe it until now, believe it now based on what happened today. The whole thing was a damn charade. When these politicians jump up and down and they're holding now pontificating, sanctimonious pontificating on something like this, and you fall for it, you're the fool. Right now, Scott Morrison is dead man walking in question time. He's carrying on like a 2-bob watch, attacking Elbow and all sorts of stupid stuff, because that is their opinion, Martin, of the Australian people. Yep. They think they're fools who will fall for it. He tried to make border security an issue today out of nowhere, right? They tried to make religion an issue out of nowhere because they think the Australian people will fall for it. So, you know, I reserve my judgment for me and my fellow Australians. If we keep falling for it, we deserve what happens to us. I don't think we should deserve what happens to us. So our party wants to make sure we stop falling for it. And that brings me to the actual issue. Because why did Christine Holgate support a postal bank? Because it's an excellent solution for Australia's financial system. It ticks so many boxes. Now, we'll talk about bail-in more in a minute, but we put out a press release today saying, you know, when you have a concern about bail-in, people always say to us, well, where do we put our money that's safe? Well, there's nowhere safe in Australia right now. But if we had a postal bank, I would say, put your money there. It's safe because any bank owned by a government like Australia's can't go broke. Any other bank can go broke if it's owned by the private sector, but a government bank can't go broke. Put your money there. That would pull the rug out from under this bail-in agenda. It would save all these regional communities. What the banks are doing in regional Australia right now is just appalling. And you were right to point it out as the contradiction to the so-called, you know, the free market, because they're claiming it's the free market and they're lying through their teeth. Dale Webster who I've got to know, who's this former journo who's gone independent, and she started this independent news service called The Regional, and you can follow her on Twitter @The Regional, and you absolutely should. Dale Webster got a Walkley grant to do a study of the regional bank branches in Australia. And this one person has shown the whole sort of record-keeping infrastructure that exists, especially in APRA, is all bogus. There are laws that says APRA is supposed to keep records of how many bank branches there are in Australia, and it's all rubbish. She's had to go through and piece it all together and show that the way APRA keeps records completely understates the extent of the problem. The banks have been closing branches like crazy, and their excuse is, oh, well, that's the market. People are moving to the internet, but they're not. That's the thing. Yeah, young people, segue over that easily, but there's a big chunk of the Australian population that's not moving to the internet in the way the banks are claiming they are. They'll move at their own speed, thank you. But the sign of that, Martin, is cash use. Cash use in Australia has never been greater. It started not just the hoarding of cash has been huge during the pandemic. That's gone up, as is the monthly withdrawals from ATMs. Monthly withdrawals from ATMs in the last period, like a year or something, has gone up by 1 million withdrawals a month. And that's from far fewer ATMs. The only thing the banks have shut down more than bank branches is ATMs. Have been pulling them out like crazy. Everywhere there used to be ATMs, they don't exist anymore. If you're lucky, there's a private ATM company still servicing an ATM for you, but invariably the bank ones are all gone. The banks are shutting down like mad, yet the withdrawals are going up. What is that? That's the market. The banks are saying, oh, no, the market is people are doing everything electronically. No, they're not. And in regional towns, they need their banks. So then the banks say, oh, the branches are unprofitable. And Dale Webster has called BS on that. None of these banks are unprofitable. It's almost impossible to actually have an unprofitable bank. It's just the profit is not great enough, right? When they can run banking now as a business where you have all these brokers flogging mortgages out of the back of their cars, right? And that's drumming up the big business for the banks, which they're interested in, which is mortgages. They're not interested anymore in the bricks and mortar of a bank branch that actually does serve their customers and all the full banking needs of their customers. They're not interested in that anymore. And they're trying to get away with using the market as the excuse just to cut off services to Australians and get away with it. Well, they will get away with it, especially under this government, but not if we have a postal bank. Because I'll tell you what will happen if we set up a postal bank. And this is a popular idea. We just have to get people to see it's realistic that it can actually get passed. If you have a postal bank in Australia, straight away, it'll do two things. One is all those communities out there will be serviced by banking services again. Bricks and mortar, you go in and you can have your exchange your cash and do all those sort of things. The banking service, the face-to-face banking service will be there. That's one. Two, all the private banks will go, well, we don't mind abandoning these regional communities to leave them without any banks if they're forced to then go and use a relative to get online and still bank with us. But if we abandon them and they have the option of going to a postal bank where they know their deposits will be safe, where they know that the cash will be supported, where they know they won't be debanked because it's a government institution, won't be allowed to discriminate against them, we're going to start losing. And they know they'll be able to get local loans for small businesses, etc., that the big banks are not inclined to give anymore. The private banks are going to start losing a lot of customers to this bank, and maybe we better rethink shutting down all our branches. Because I don't know if we've talked about this before, Martin, but in the Campbell report in 1982, which was the report, the first financial system inquiry that set the agenda for deregulating the Australian financial system and privatising all the public banks, the state banks, the Commonwealth Bank, etc. That report, in talking about the privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank, it predicted when the Commonwealth Bank is privatised, the private banks will start shutting branches. Why could it predict that? Because it knew there would be no more competition for the private banks and they wouldn't need to compete on service anymore and they would just start withdrawing those services from marginal areas. So how do you reverse that? Bring back a public bank and do it in the same way the Commonwealth Bank was set up. The Commonwealth Bank was set up in 1912 in post offices, right, before it extended out to permanent branches. But that was our public bank then. Our idea is, well, that worked well. Let's set up a public, we've got a bill, Commonwealth Postal Savings Bank. Let's set it up. But this time, because there is this natural symbiosis between banking services and postal services, it's worked actually around the world. It's become a common thing. Postal banks are very successful. Let's actually make it a permanent thing, a permanent postal savings banks for Australians that'll always provide banking services and also support the postal service, which is a very important service as well. That's the idea. That's the plan. That's the solution. It'll work perfectly. And the only people that are going to miss out are the predatory profiteers at the private banks.
Yeah, and interestingly, of course, in the UK, they actually have now a number of banks sitting inside the post office in the UK, and it's working very well. And it's providing precisely the services that are required locally on the ground. And Christine
Holgate, when she pioneered Bank at Post, like we already had Bank at Post, but when she expanded, etc., she was consulting with banks, with post offices all around the world. They're all paying attention, and the British, what is it called, Royal Mail or whatever, the post office service there, paid attention to that, and it certainly influenced them too.
Absolutely. And so, just sort of bringing that little part of the conversation to a close, there is a solution. It's a simple solution. The infrastructure is already there. Banks today are providing connectivity through to the post office and vice versa. So actually, it makes a lot of sense from all sorts of ways. But if the post offices actually started providing banking services, not just somebody else's, but they're under their own shingle, then of course it completely revolutionises the way that banking services could be delivered. And that's what we need to see in our local communities, because I know we've lost down in our local area here. We've lost the CBA, the ANZ. We actually have no major banks. We've got a couple of credit unions in the town here. Everybody else has to go down the road, quite a long way down the road actually, to get access to any of those services. And in the case of St George, you now have to go down to Wollongong because there's nothing. So think about what that does in terms of the inconvenience and everything else, and the extra costs.
I did get to know Christine Holgate through the experience of the campaign and the inquiry that we got going, and I was amazed by. I mean, in many ways, she's a genius, but she's not really. She's just a normal person who got to the top, became a very successful executive at a few places, but never lost her humanity. And she understood what ordinary people felt. And so this is why she fought so hard to save Bank at Post in 2018. And she described to me what it means for local communities if you lose your banks and you lose your the post office as the last financial outlet, because people who are used to banking there, they come there to do their banking because that's something you've got to do. And then when they're in town, they'll go next door to the coffee shop, they'll go to the other direction to the newsagent, they'll go to the bakery, and the financial service attracts all sorts of other local business and it keeps the town alive. You lose that, and that town withers and dies because everyone has to, you're not going to stop at the local place if you have to go to the next big centre for your financial services, right? And this is, she instinctively understood that by saving the Bank at Post, she was saving regional communities in Australia. And remember, that's what I got so irate about. She saved it in 2018. She was so appreciative of the executives who helped her. She gave them She gave 4 of them $5,000 watches, which is cheap by Cartier standards. And 2 years later, petty politicians crucified her for it because they had other agendas, right? And we were the only ones to stand up for her. But the whole story's come out, and the legacy for that. We didn't get Christine Holgate back at Australia Post, but we can win a postal bank. As part of that campaign, we met and spoke to a lot of politicians across the board. Every single party supports a postal bank. I got into a lift with Bill Shorten and in the last hearing at the hotel we were staying at. He just happened to be on the lift. And so we're having a chat. And when we got to the top floor, which isn't that many floors in Canberra, but anyway, we got to the top floor. I said, Bill, the solution is we need a postal bank. And he said, I agree. Just straight out, I agree. I had National Party people saying to me, I agree. I had a Liberal Member of Parliament say, I agree, right? The Greens agree. One Nation agrees. Bob Catter agrees. He wants to put in the bill to do it. They all agree. There'll be some hardcore, bank Johnnies around Scott Morrison, people like Jane Hume, Josh Frydenberg, Tim Wilson, the whole IPA crowd, they won't agree. But the majority of people in the building probably agree. It's just that they don't know, they don't talk to each other. We have to reflect back to them how popular this is. It's something that if enough Australians get behind, so we're going to make it the centrepiece of our election campaign, actually, Martin, but it's not just to be our election campaign. We want this to be an election campaign issue. We want this to be a policy all the parties recognise as popular and try and steal office. Go ahead. Let's get a postal bank, right? And here's you said earlier it's a simple solution. It absolutely is. But I want people to be clear on it's more than symbolic, but let's just use the term symbolic for now, on the symbolic significance of it. There's a reason that in that Campbell report in 1982, it said, and the Campbell report is like the Bible of the neoliberal takedown of Australia.
Yep.
It demanded all public banks must be privatised. Why? Well, we know why, because we documented the history of this with Australia. That was always the fight for 100 years in this country. Who controls banking? That's why the old Labor Party, who were the big champions of a national bank, called it the money power. Who controls banking? In 1937, in the Fremantle Town Hall, September 1937, at the Labor Party's campaign launch, John Curtin, who didn't win that election, but he won, he got elected a few years later. John Curtin said, if the government is not involved in monetary policy through having its own national bank, it cannot govern except in a secondary degree. In other words, someone else has more power than the government of the day. That's what he was saying, right? The democratic institution is overpowered by something else, and that's this money power. And the whole point of public banks is, you could do it the old commie way and nationalise the damn lot, and sometimes you're tempted to do it. And of course, the most capitalist place in the world, the City of London, didn't mind having their banks nationalised to save their butts in 2008. The ideology flew out the window then. But you don't have to do that. What you need to do is make sure, though, that the government does not deny itself this power. You have public banks that you can use that credit-creating power that the banks have, but make sure it's used to serve the public. That's what they do. And for the ideologue neoliberals, they despise this because all their ideology is window dressing to cover this power grab. This is the core power grab. And that's why it's symbolically very, very significant. If we can get this postal bank up, it's the first foot in the door. We want a whole national banking system. We've got all sorts of legislation and plans for a development bank, an infrastructure bank, and overhauling the Reserve Bank, etc. But if we can start with this postal bank, we are finally winning the battle back against this plot to take down our country, this neoliberal plot that was laid out 40 years ago.
Yeah, and Robbie, one other point. If you look carefully at the senior leaders within the current incumbent government, right? It's interesting how many of them are ex-merchant bankers, yes. Right? So they are basically wired, I would say perhaps even more than wired, to think neoliberalism, to think, the way that, we spoke about earlier on, but they are not actually representing the broad opinion across the political landscape in Canberra or beyond, or indeed in the country, right? They are wired and connected to the financial system itself.
And it's like they're incapable of thinking outside of that. And I think we've met them all. in the course, especially in the course of the last 4 years. The first one we had a run in with was Jane Hume herself, who we promptly nicknamed the Senator for Bankers. She did the original bail-in inquiry, and then an inquiry into the Glass-Steagall bill we got put up, and showed us that this former banker, NAB, Deutsche Bank, Rothschild, this former, she's from those three banks. Josh Frydenberg's from Deutsche Bank. Even what's his name, Little Proud, he's a former banker. Whole bunch of them are former bankers. And the one who's not a former banker, who's Scotty from marketing, he's actually more a banker's suckhole than the rest of them. I mean, that guy is the worst of the worst. He has never met a banker whose butt he doesn't kiss. And then I sometimes laugh when he carries on in answers in question time, where he'll say things like, "We stood up to the banks." How do you? He's one of these guys that doesn't even know when he's lying anymore, right? He's so lost it. He's so deep down whatever alternative reality is constructed in his head. When Christine Holgate was fighting the banks to try and get him to sign up to a bank at Post deal in 2018, the executives would be nice to her face because she's a fellow CEO, and they had to be nice to her, and she's a nice person. But behind her back, they would call Scott Morrison, the treasurer, and bitch to him about Christine Holgate trying to make him pay for Australia Post serving their customers. And that's one of the reasons he was so nasty to her, right? Because he was well and truly on the bank's side in this whole fight. So there's Morrison, and he's surrounded by all these investment bankers. And then the institutions, Martin, there's a revolving door between especially Treasury and the banks.
And the regulators.
And the regulators.
Don't forget the regulators. Yeah.
100%. So they only think in one way. And I'll give you an example, actually. Sorry, we're casual. I do want to share the screen. Can I show you something?
Hang on a second.
Okay, sorry.
No, that's fine. So
I told Martin I didn't think I had, but I do have one thing. I just wanted you guys to see this.
All right. So I've enabled that. Get rid of that. All right. So share your screen, and then I'll put it up once it's shared.
So
you haven't shared it yet.
Sorry, I haven't shared it.
You'll have to share it still.
Oh yeah, I see.
It's all right.
Share. Okay, sorry about that.
That's okay. So.
All right, can you see a document on my screen?
Yeah, I'm just going to switch across to it now. There you go. That's the document.
All right, I'm just going to so you guys can all see it. So you know I'm not making this up. So last year, out of the blue, Senator Kimberly Kitching, my favourite, she moved for a Senate inquiry into manufacturing. And we thought, this is great. Let's participate in that. And we encourage people to make submissions calling for a national development bank, which can be a dedicated bank that can have a lot of industry expertise in it, but be able to put out cheap credit on flexible terms to help industry. You lend to your farmers and you lend to manufacturers on flexible terms. You can have all these trade and technical experts that help the manufacturers that are usually just engineering types bring products to market, and you make sure that they're manufactured in Australia, right? And that's what you can do with the National Development Bank. The great success of countries like China and Japan has been around using these state industry-specific, sometimes banks, development banks, to make their economies successful. And we know their economies are successful. We say we want successful economies like that. Well, let's just do it. So anyway, they made a submission. They did this inquiry. The upshot of the inquiry was that Labor, the majority on the committee, recommended they should set up a fund for manufacturing. Well, the fund's fine, but it's nowhere near as powerful as a bank. A bank can create credit. A fund is a finite amount of money. You spend it, and then you just got to wait till it gets replenished. A bank has a lot more power than that. That's why they should use a bank. But of course, the block is an ideological one. The Liberals on this inquiry, Martin, said that they oppose any kind of government support for manufacturing because that hasn't worked in the past. That's what they said, right? And these are the people who want to take us to war against China, by the way. How are we going to bloom and manufacture for ourselves with these clowns in charge? Anyway, but then there's this. This is what I wanted to show people. So for regular viewers, you'll recognise that when I come on the show, I'm always telling you, and with Martin's backup, get involved in our latest campaign. So suddenly there's 3 paragraphs about us. Well, and they say the following: while 130 submissions is a reasonably large number for an inquiry, approximately 2/3 of those submissions were made by members or supporters of the Australian Citizens Party, formerly the CEC. The Australian Citizens Party frequently conducts mass campaigns on economic issues such as banking, currency regulations, and manufacturing. They are disposed to focus on policies that were implemented in the 1950s and 1960s. And they tend to advocate, regardless of the specific issue, for the same suite of measures, including the establishment of a national development or postal bank, instituting Glass-Steagall banking regulations, building the Bradfield scheme to pump water from Queensland to New South Wales and Victoria, and a return to tariff protection. The Australian Citizens Party itself also provided a submission which mirrored these themes, but also included additional modern themes such as thorium, nuclear reactors, and nanotechnology. And so my point is, it's quite extraordinary that we're just participants in this inquiry. We ended up becoming a subject of the inquiry itself. Now, why? Well, Kimberly Kitching was the mover behind this inquiry, our friend, our frenemy, can I say? And of course, the secretary of this committee is the one and only Mark Fitt. And for those who are around for the cash ban campaign, you may remember that name. This Mark Fitt is the permanent secretary of this economics committee. And we have had run-ins with him since 2017. And what they're basically saying here is this upstart party thinks they can participate in our inquiries. Well, get stuffed, bureaucrats. We're going to. But the funniest thing was this line here. Now, bear in mind, this is a manufacturing inquiry. And the whole purpose of this inquiry, Martin, was to basically pay lip service to the idea we should get more manufacturing. I mean, that's what everyone talks about, right? So they say here, we are disposed to focus on policies that were implemented in the 50s and 60s. Martin, do you know when the pinnacle of Australian manufacturing was?
Oh, good question. Short answer is no, I have no idea.
Well, the dates are right in front of you. It was in the 50s and 60s.
Okay, all right. That tells you something.
In other words, we have identified what made manufacturing successful then, and we're pointing out to them, you want to make manufacturing successful, do what works. Right, yeah. And they treat that with disdain, as this report reflects. But that's the major parties for you. They're not going to save us. We're going to have to build a movement to save ourselves, but we know we're on the right track.
Yeah, and the fact is, go back a little bit what I said earlier on, and that is that the whole concept is to finance into the real economy, right? To help businesses do real things. And, in my small business services surveys that I run all the time, I'm seeing more and more small businesses completely unable to get any financing from the banking system that currently exists. They can't actually innovate. They can't develop their own businesses because they can't get the finance. And if you look carefully at the statistics in the last 3 or 4 years, financing to big business has gone up significantly, but financing to small business has actually dropped. Thereby is the problem.
Well, of course, our friend, I'll just share my screen again, just quickly to show the viewers this. This is actually we might have shown this on the show ages ago. This is from Investment Analytics, which is Dr. Wilson's site. Robert Gottliebson wrote an article in the Australian a couple of weeks ago using this graph because it was used in a report by another friend of ours, Martin, John Dalson, the former ANZ director, who's very concerned about this phenomenon. But this illustrates what you're talking about. And that's including all business. The red line there is all business. Since this is 1988, bank lending, which mostly went to business 2/3 to business, 1/3 to mortgages, has completely inverted. The crossover was around the year 2000, roughly the time of the repeal of Glass-Steagall and some big shifts in Australia, like the 50% discount to capital gains tax and the beginning of the first homeowners grant and all that sort of thing, where they actually deliberately inflated a property bubble. And you can see the effect. And John Dalston wrote a paper about the damaging impact that this part has had, because business has been denied credit. Now, big business has options that small business, as you know, doesn't have. Small business needs banks that can help provide that kind of credit, but they've been starved of it. And that has enormous consequences. My mother-in-law would like to sell. She owns a monopoly, and it's a pub in a beautiful country town in Western Australia. And people who are interested in buying the pub off her, it's the only one in town, they cannot get money from the bank. The banks won't lend them money because the local banker doesn't make that decision anymore. People either in Perth or probably more likely Sydney make the decision. They don't have a sense of the local economy. All they're interested in is probably quotas to do with mortgages, right? And that's just one example. Whoever borrows from the bank to buy this pub couldn't go bankrupt in a fit. And that's repeated all around the country. So our postal bank will lend money into local communities. It has to be set up so that local branch managers are the decision makers for that kind of lending. The people who know the local towns. You've got to bring that whole model back, because you've got to get credit going again into businesses. And what's the irony for me is that the banks are focusing on the mortgages while denying credit to the businesses who employ the people who have to pay the mortgages.
Yep.
Right? This is bonkers. Yep. Did we have a housing shortage before 1988, a debilitating housing shortage with so much less credit going into housing? I don't think so. Clearly not. We did. The value was the relative value was only 3 or 4 times income, whereas now it's 10 times. So there clearly wasn't a housing shortage, and there was much less credit going into housing compared to business. Our economy worked relatively well compared to now. It worked fine.
Yeah, and the things I think about is if I'm a bank at the moment, if I've got $1 to lend, right, I can lend it for housing. And I need a very small amount of capital to hold against it. Right?
Yeah.
If I lend that same dollar to a business, I have to put a much bigger cost of capital against it. And that's because of the international supervisory structure through the Bank of International Settlements and the capital management rules that are in place. So some of this is driven by, poor decisions locally, but it's also driven by the international structural issues in the finance sector and the fact that we have those international rules that work in favour of the big guys, tilt the playing field very much towards home lending and against commercial lending. And once again, it goes back to this neoliberal philosophy, which is driving the regulation of the banks too.
Yeah, and you're not going to change that culture very quickly. So if you decided to try and take the approach of, well, let's not add government banks, let's try and change the culture of the private banks, even if you had goodwill among the private bankers, that would be very, very, actually very hard to change. It'll take a long time. What you achieve by establishing public banks is, first of all, they don't have to be bound by Basel rules. They can tell Basel to bugger off, because the ostensible reason for Basel rules is stability of the banking system. Well, these are banks owned by the governments, right? They got all the capital in the world, right? The whole wealth of the nation is backing them up. And in fact, there's a great quote from Denison Miller, the first governor of the Commonwealth Bank, when the Commonwealth Bank was set up. He said, he started operation without any capital. He said, we are starting this bank without any capital because we are backed up by the whole resources of the Australian people, right? And because they could, and it worked. And I mentioned in today's press release that, the first way that the Commonwealth Bank proved itself, because it was set up in 1912, where it first proved itself and got world attention was in the 1914 banking panic. Because not only did it stop a banking run in Australia, there was a danger of a run on the private banks in Australia, and the Commonwealth Bank stopped it because Dennis and Miller made an announcement that the Commonwealth Bank stood behind not just its deposits, but all deposits in all banks, right? So nobody needed to panic, and there was no bank run in Australia as a result of that. But you probably know the history a bit, Martin. The 1914 banking panic in London was the epicenter of this. It was really debilitating. All the banks closed, or most of them closed. The only bank branch that didn't close in London in the 1914 banking panic was the London branch of Australia's brand new Commonwealth Bank. It was the only one that kept open and kept operating because it was backed by the Australian government. So we don't need to be bound by Basel rules. And so what you can do is get the government to start getting involved in banking again. A postal bank is a retail bank, provide retail banking services. You can use development banks for manufacturing and agricultural industries. You can have an infrastructure bank that lends to the various levels of government to build their infrastructure, long-term credit, etc. Don't worry about public-private partnerships. Don't worry about raising big heaps of foreign capital or whatever. Just do it all yourself. You allow the Australian people to invest in these things through their superannuation, so it can be an intermediary for that as well. But the risk is borne by the bank, right? Not the investor. These can actually be guaranteed investments. And what you will do is they can make those lending decisions that the private banks almost wouldn't dare to. They can take on risks that the private banks wouldn't. But in doing so, in doing the heavy lifting, generate a lot of growth in economic activity that suddenly there's a lot of opportunities for everybody, right? The private banks can come back in and say, well, clearly, there's in these regional communities, they're now growing. They're not shrinking. They're now growing. So we're prepared to make small business lending decisions again and make farm lending decisions again that we're otherwise reversed to, because we now see there's less risk involved because it's a growing economy, right? And you can turn around the culture that way. If you're not ideological, you can actually do it in a problem-solving way and quite straightforwardly. If you are ideological and you think, as Joe Hockey pronounced in February 2009, we use a clip on one of our videos. He gets up there 3 months after the global financial crisis, and he's in Parliament. He goes, "If there's one thing we've learned, Mr. Speaker, from the global financial crisis is that government shouldn't be involved in banking." I think, what planet are you on, mate? We haven't been involved in banking for 30 years. You guys stuffed this up, right? Your wife at Deutsche Bank, mate, stuffed this up, So those ideologues, they'll see it in a totally twisted way, and they'll never do it. But people who are just not ideological and want to solve problems, this is the solution. Let's put it to work.
Absolutely. Well, let's take the conversation slightly further forward, because there's another reason why the current structure of banking is also very, very risky, right? And that is because we have a small number of very large organizations who are highly leveraged through derivatives and who are highly manipulative of the whole financial system. And we basically have highly speculative entities bolted on to standard banks.
Yes.
Right? And one of the outfalls of that is that money deposited in those banks, standard money, like ordinary deposits, fall effectively within the risk category of the total bank.
Yep.
And that, of course, is where this whole question of bail-in, deposit bail-in in particular, and the risk structures that actually exist in the financial system comes to play, right? So not only do we need, the sort of the postal bank story, we need to also to think about the risks in the broader banking system and how we can isolate ordinary banking, the banking we need, from the highly speculative, highly risky, I don't know what the latest number on the derivatives is, but it's huge and getting bigger by the day, and the whole overall debt mountain is bigger than it's ever been. Another whole area to explore here, right, which is why we've got to tease it apart.
Well, let's start with breaking news, because if I don't start with that, I'll forget it later. A couple of interesting developments on bail-in, and of course, bail-in is what happens when you let investment bankers take over your deposits and run your bank into the ground. Then they want to use they turn a boring bank, which should be like an old family sedan, into a racing car, and they turn the bank customers into the airbags and the buffers on the outside, because you'll be the crash absorbers, and that's what bail-in essentially is. So, interesting development, which was in New Zealand. In October, the New Zealand government quietly made an announcement to backtrack on an announcement they'd made in April last year. So in April last year, the New Zealand government said that they would enact statutory bail-in law. Now, to explain the difference quite as simply as possible, regular viewers would be familiar with New Zealand and bail-in because it actually has the most far-reaching bail-in powers of all the countries. But these are actually powers that its Reserve Bank has as directions powers. The Reserve Bank, it's called Open Bank Resolution. It's something the Reserve Bank of New Zealand developed in the early 2000s. And funnily enough, it developed it independently of the Bank for International Settlements and the Financial Stability Board there that set up the current global bail-in system as we know it. And essentially New Zealand's quite open about how this open bank resolution will work. And they say, if a bank goes under, we're going to take your deposits, use what we need to keep the bank propped up, prop the bank back up, and whatever we don't use, you can have back. In other words, you will lose a percentage of your deposits to keep the bank going. And they have this color graphic on their site, etc., that we've shown viewers before. They said in April that they were going to follow the IMF's recommendation to actually pass bail-in as specific legislation. It's called statutory bail-in, fully in accordance with the Financial Stability Board, but the purpose of doing it through legislation is to make sure every part of it is spelt out clearly, right? Here's what can be bail-in, here's the circumstances it will, here's the protections, etc. Now, when you do something like that, to get a bill through Parliament, it has to be debated. And what we've noticed around the world is every country that actually has bail-in legislation, they enacted it quite secretly, where there was no public debate. And the only countries that have actually had proper bail-in debates have been Australia and India. And both of those debates started in 2017. In India, the government there put up a bail-in bill, but that was a year after the government, so you may remember, did this incredible cash conversion thing. They just gutted cash use and they made people change denominations or whatever, and it totally enraged the Indian people. So less than a year later, when they put up this bail-in law, the Indian people got whiff of it and said, no way, and there was a massive public backlash. The Indian government dropped it. Well, around the same time, the Australian government put up the law that we identified as a bail-in law. But because in Australia, the Citizens Party had been making a stink about bail-in since 2013, and this had been a huge campaign of ours, Australians were the most informed about bail-in of anywhere in the world. And we were on the lookout for something that was going to be done underhandedly. And sure enough, Scott Morrison obliged and put up this law, and there was this little loophole, right? And the loophole is something that, it says conversion and write-off provisions apply to these forms of capital or any other instruments. And those 4 words, or any other instruments, are enough such that in a crisis, if something doesn't expressly forbid APRA from doing a bail-in, which nothing does, it can use those words to actually execute a bail-in. That was our concern. Now, the government, as you know, snuck that through on Valentine's Day 4 years ago. So yesterday was the 4th anniversary of the sneaking of that bill through. 8 senators present in the chamber. I'm up in the gallery watching this. It was shocking how quickly it happened. And they got this bill through, didn't even take it to a proper vote, where all the senators would have to at least file in the chamber and say, what are we voting on, right? And the government ever since has denied that it's a bail-in law. But one of the things that makes me laugh all the time, Martin, is in denying it's a bail-in law. The government says, hand on heart, we would never bail in deposits in Australia because that would destabilise the entire financial system. That would be a ridiculous thing to do. Those words are effectively our government saying that every other government of the G20 and the Financial Stability Board and the Bank for International Settlements are financial idiots who are destabilising the global financial system. Because that is their policy that we agreed to at a G20 meeting in 2009. They're just trying to lie and pretend they didn't, right? That's the effect of that claim. So anyway, the Kiwis, the IMF has said though that these sort of ad hoc systems aren't good enough. You need a proper statutory bail-in law. So the Kiwis said in April, we're going to pass a bail-in law. And in October, they said, no, we're not. We're dropping that idea. And I can mark my words, what they were running away from was a public debate. Because a public debate, considering what we've had here, and we would have helped it, which nowadays is called foreign interference, but they can get stuff. We can help educate people in New Zealand. Plenty of them watch your show anyway, Martin, as you know. A public debate would have had the same effect as a country like India. This would have blown up in their face. So if the Ardern government's on the run, I'm saying to Kiwis, well, keep them on the run and tell them to scrap the open bank resolution at the Reserve Bank as well over there. And Australians should take heart from that. And let's get our bail-in law completely dropped as well. And the way to do that is to simply amend the Banking Act where those four words are and get rid of them or qualify them to explicitly say any other instruments absolutely never including deposits. So the One Nation Party, Senator Malcolm Roberts, has an amendment for that. He tried to pass it as a bill in 2020 and remember how that went. And actually that exposed, a lot of people came out of the woodwork and said, yeah, bail-in is a real danger in Australia and confirmed that we were right. The government was freaked out that they might lose votes over that bill. So they said they would negotiate with One Nation to come up with a satisfactory resolution. Of course, that has proved to be words and nothing's happened. So what One Nation is looking at now is there's a Treasury bill about to be put up in the next sitting of Parliament. There's only one more sitting of Parliament scheduled. There's a Treasury bill, and they're going to see if they can move an amendment to that bill that amends the Banking Act. So just that's what's in discussion at the moment. Watch this space. We'll announce it when it's a concrete plan, so that when we announce it, people can help us by hitting the phones and calling their members of Parliament and senators to say, vote for One Nation's amendment. Right? Let's get that. All our amendment does, remember, Mark, we talked about this many times, all that amendment does is confirm in legislation what the government reassures the public in letters.
Yep.
But in letters, it's meaningless. In legislation, it's meaningful. That's all it does.
And John Hewson, that very famous ex-politician and academic now, said it's a no-brainer.
That's right. Pass it. It's a no-brainer. This will restore. This is us helping to restore confidence in the system. So that'll go a long way towards doing that. But apart from that, you're right. And the two options that people have to know are solutions to this is one, as I said earlier, the postal bank. Let's get a postal bank. You can put your deposits in there, right? Second, though, you still want the private banks to reform their ways, because the way people who are supporters of the Glass-Steagall separation principle, and Glass-Steagall was the American law that was in place from 1933 until 1999. And the argument was, look, you've got to have a Glass-Steagall separation between commercial banks with deposits and investment banking, because they're actually two entirely different species of financial activity. Just because they're both called banking, they're not, right? Banking should be treated almost like utilities, right? Keep those banks with deposits boring, just take deposits, make loans into the real economy. That's it. That's what those banks do. All other forms of financial activity, especially investment banking, there's no point trying to ban everything to do with derivatives, because I'll just keep inventing more and get around the bans. So what you do is you have this gulf between the two forms of the financial system. And so people know that if you're in the commercial banks with your deposits, you're safe. But if you go into that area, that's fine. You're going to be allowed to do that, but it's entirely at your own risk. No one will ever bail you out. Only gamble what you can afford to lose. So you just treat it like going to a casino, right? Only gamble what you can afford to lose. And if you lose, you'll lose. The governments aren't going to bail you out. And that will, one, protect the real economy from those kind of financial crises, but two, it'll make those financial crises less likely, because once they realise they're not going to be bailed out by governments, they're not going to be as reckless with other people's money. Right? And that's what Glass-Steagall can achieve. And so we've got a bill there that we've actually had introduced into Parliament twice. The Senator for Bankers, Jane Hume, shot it down in 2019. But nevertheless, it's there. It's ready to go whenever Australia wants that solution. These are the things that can be done to clean up the systemic risks that are in Australia's financial system right now.
Yeah, and I'll just make the other point, Robbie. There's a fundamental difference between making money by simply charging interest on the money that you've already got, right? And taking bets on the which way markets are going to go, right? That's not actually creating new money at all. All that is doing is just basically speculating on that. The other is to actually invest in real things that creates real jobs and real growth and real momentum. That's creating real money and growth in the economy, right? And unfortunately, most economies around the world have swung dramatically towards the financial engineering and the making money off the back of making money off the back of making money. To do that, you need enough mugs who are willing and able to keep paying, right? Keep paying for 35 years on a mortgage, keep paying on a buy now, pay later, or on a credit card or whatever it is, right? Because what they're actually doing is turning most people into a series of cash flows over a long, long time. And then they're speculating on the back of that and using speculative instruments to magnify the profits. But it's not real profit, it's just illusory, right? That's completely different from the banking that we're talking about, whereas what you're doing is you're actually providing real funding for real business opportunities to create real business to help them grow and create things, right? And so we've got to swing that pendulum back away from the financialization of everything back to finance as an enabler of real things. And so Glass-Steagall is part of that, the Postal Bank's part of that. Other point I'd make is that there's a very important observation with regard to bail-in, right? If in fact they did bail-in deposits, the government would then not need to tap the $250,000 deposit guarantee scheme, which of course keeps people comfortable at night, because of course it basically says, well, the government will pay out up to 250k for individuals or joint accounts, right, on deposit. But if they actually do a deposit bail-in, they won't need to activate that. And that's a very interesting interaction between those two things that nobody in official circles, one, wants to admit, or two, wants to talk about. They keep defaulting back to the 250k argument and say, no, it can never happen because 250k. Yeah. But that's not the same thing as bail-in, is it?
They absolutely don't want to talk about the details of that, because you're right. So the way the financial claims scheme is structured is an institution has to collapse first. And when it does, the Treasurer may, not must, may activate the financial claims scheme. He's not obliged to. Scott Morrison has confirmed in writing he's not obliged to. This is open to the Treasurer's discretion. And if the Treasurer decides to activate the financial claims scheme, then supposedly $250,000 per depositor is guaranteed, except the provision they've made for that in total is only $20 billion. That's not $20 billion sitting there. They've made a provision to say they will somehow conjure up $20 billion to pay for it, except the Council of Financial Regulators and the Financial Stability Board, two separate institutions, one's the Australian regulators and one's the Financial Stability Board in Switzerland, have both said, well, that as it's structured is not enough to cover any of the deposits in the big four banks, because they're in the hundreds of billions of dollars each, and in fact cumulatively represent 80% of all bank deposits. So this claim scheme, even if it does work, won't be enough to cover 80% of all deposits. And that's the mechanisms as it's set up. Yep. And the thing is, the politicians say to us in response to bail-in, well, this will protect you from bail-in. But the whole purpose of bail-in, as you just said, is to stop that first step, the collapse of the bank. Bail-in happens earlier. So you never get to that point. And therefore, there will be no trigger for the financial claims scheme. And politicians want to keep their head in the sand on this. Not all of them, but I must say, sadly, that I know one politician whose attention we've well and truly attracted on this, and unfortunately, he's retiring. I wish he was. I wish he was still going to be in there.
One other thing quickly, Robbie, and that is, guess who dreamed up deposit bail-in? It's worth just asking that question too, isn't it?
Well, if you know the certain species of animal that dreamed it up, you won't be surprised. I know it's a great story. The short answer is investment bankers dreamed it up.
Exactly.
There's a one of the British members of the House of Lords who was a big advocate for he's actually still there and doing some good work. Lord Forsyth of Drumley. He did an inquiry into quantitative easing. I think it came out last year to say quantitative easing has not helped the real economy at all. But in the great debate in the British Parliament on bail-in Glass-Steagall in 2013, Lord Forsyth, who is himself a former merchant banker, he said, investment bankers are extremely adept at finding a way between the wallpaper and the wall. There's nothing they won't scheme up. And some of the things that get announced out of Morrison and Frydenberg's office, I know they're employing investment bankers to come up with these schemes. And yeah, they were these two guys from CS First Boston. They were at the fateful weekend meeting of the New York Federal Reserve that tried to rescue Lehman Brothers, and they left that meeting and thought, well, Lehman Brothers owed $25 billion they couldn't pay, but because they defaulted, then that set off $150 billion in derivatives. That set off a chain reaction to all these other institutions. If we had been able to get that $25 billion from their own customers, instead of bail out through taxpayers, bail in their customers, they lose the money, it would save the whole system. Yep. That was their logic. Yep. And that idea was picked up and run with. Mark Carney from the Bank of England, a former Goldman Sachs man, he was the biggest champion of it. And in fact, he did more than anyone else to make it happen. The current Prime Minister of Italy, Mario Draghi, another former Goldman Sachs guy, he was the head of the Financial Stability Board when it actually developed the policy. And yeah, it's the gift to the world from investment bankers who half of them should have gone to jail after 2008, but they're the master of the universe. And maybe that's a good way, Martin, to segue to a discussion about financial regulation, because one of the problems we have in Australia, we've got all these things that can be done to fix up the mechanics of the system, but we have a massive problem in Australia with existing financial regulation and things like consumer protection, which is absolutely powerless and has turned Australia into what a former head of the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, Greg Medcraft, admitted. He said Australia is a paradise for white-collar criminals. And the reason it's a paradise for white-collar criminals is because ASIC is a weak and ineffective regulator, and it's kept that way by the government because that's what the banks want. And around the time of the Royal Commission, a former ASIC lawyer came out and said, yeah, when I worked at ASIC, I was told your job is to do what the banks want, right? And what that doesn't just allow the banks to, prey on people. There's financial predators all over the place that get to just devour unsuspecting, unsophisticated investors. And if they fall victim to this, Martin, there's never any justice, right? So another update from me is that we've been involved in this Sterling First inquiry. And Sterling First was the collapse of this Rent for Life scheme, where most of the victims were in around Mandurah in Western Australia. But it's a relatively small collapse. 140 people fell victim of this, but these are elderly, vulnerable, sick, chronically sick, and sometimes terminally sick people. They can't start again, and they're all about to be evicted from their homes. And all they thought they were doing was signing up to prepay their rent for the rest of their life, and instead they were being sucked into a very sophisticated, nasty managed investment scheme. And the thing is, the Western Australian Consumer Department knew it was dodgy from the beginning, and ASIC, the federal regulator, knew it was dodgy from the beginning. The inquiry has confirmed this, but what do? What's the recommendation? Well, it's lame. It's pathetic. Now, thank goodness Senator Malcolm Roberts participated, because he put out a clear call in the inquiry report that was handed down 2 weeks ago that given that the failings of ASIC, clear failings of its responsibility, are so blatant, these victims must be compensated in full plus interest, because that's the only way you're going to be able to stop them from becoming homeless. The country cannot wash its hands of these victims. They must be compensated. But the new boss of ASIC, Joe Longo, he sat there, and he's only became the boss this year. He wasn't at ASIC when this happened, but he was covering its ass like crazy, because his job is to make sure that ASIC's culture doesn't change. He complained that such a small collapse had led to such a big inquiry. He couldn't believe this was happening. And the reason it led to such a big inquiry is not just because we got involved, but because this clearly shows that ASIC is not fit for purpose. Now, neither is APRA and the other regulators, but ASIC in particular is not fit for purpose. It must be overhauled. So this case cannot just be about compensating the victims. It must lead to the overhaul of ASIC so that it stops being a weak and ineffective regulator and becomes a regulator with teeth. Now, we don't have time to go into it now, but the previous head of ASIC, who was down there for a couple of years, and his deputy, Daniel Crennan said in 2019, in the financial review, he said, the banks should fear us. That's what he said. And I tell you what, the banks would have taken that quote and stuck it on their dartboard and been throwing darts at it for the following 2 years, because they engineered a way to get him and his boss, James Shipton, out of there, because there's no way that they intended to be feared. That they were going to fear ASIC, right? Yeah, that's exactly what should happen. Financial predators should fear the regulator, and it's deliberately kept so that they don't. So that is a campaign that we're going to keep pushing to make that happen. And part of that campaign is we have a problem in Australia that all Australians need to be very conscious of, and that's this. Let's say we achieve a clean out of the financial system, and we achieve these institutions that can make it work much better. Let's say we do all that, and we absolutely must fight for that and do it. We cannot ignore the fact that there is fallout from decades of a dysfunctional system. There are hundreds of thousands of victims out there, hundreds of thousands. Their lives have been ruined by this system, and they must have justice. They cannot be swept under the carpet and say, "Oh, oops, we'll do better from now on." No. There must be accountability. They must have justice, and that means compensation. Now, the government said after the Royal Commission they'll set up this thing called the Compensation Scheme of Last Resort. They already have made it so narrow, it's not going to damn compensate anybody, especially these sterling victims. So there's a campaign to expand that so that it can cover more people, and that's fine. But then we've just recently become more aware of there's another element involved, another gatekeeper in the picture, which is this thing called the Australian Financial Complaints Authority. And this is what Scott Morrison set up in 2017. Now, and it was legislated in 2018. And this institution is a breakwater for the banks. The way a breakwater works is you have stormy waves, and you set up so they don't wash away the sand. You create a breakwater so that the waves crash on the breakwater, lose their power, and by the time they get into the beach, they don't wash the sand away. Well, the sand is the banks. The stormy waves are the thousands and thousands of bank victims. And Scott Morrison deliberately set up this thing called the AFCA, which was a remodel of the old Financial Ombudsman Service, which itself is a product of the self-regulation of the industry, which is an oxymoron, right? This is fake regulation. It's not self-regulation. The original FOSS Ombudsman Service was set up by the banks themselves. this final version of APRA is a private corporation. It's exempt from freedom of information requests. It's exempt from being called before Parliament, before the committees of Parliament to answer questions. It's exempt from all that. It's funded by the banks. It rules out 50% of complaints straight away. It just draws a line through them and says, we're not going to look at those, right? 50% straight away. Only about 8% of complaints get to some form of resolution. And of those, 80% of the resolutions are in favour of the banks. Right, and this is what you get if Scott Morrison sets up something to supposedly address the concerns of financial victims. It is, and it's right there in the heart of the system. The whole thing has to be overhauled. There is no goodwill in these institutions to serve the Australian people. Right, so these inquiries become quite instructive because you start unpeeling the layers of the onion. And you see, because you have to be in a certain position to actually be able to unpeel them. What just comes out is you see the dysfunctionality of the system, but the deliberate intent behind that dysfunctionality, and that's both demoralising because it's like, how corrupt, no wonder a paradise for white collar criminals. But then on the other hand, it's enlightening and empowering because now we know exactly what we have to clean up. So all these things. The book has to be open on it all, and we have to clean up this system. I went to an event in the Hunter Valley just before Christmas where the independent financial planners invited me to come along and be part of a political panel, actually, that included your former premier there, Nathan Rees, and someone representing the Liberal side of politics, and we had a bit of a chin wag and a debate among ourselves. But these financial planners were pointing out that there's just from managed investment schemes since 2008, there are 200,000 victims who collectively have lost $40 billion, Martin, just from 2008. And the reason that's significant is those are the victims that the Commissioner of the Royal Commission, Kenneth Haynes, said all their cases should be looked at. $40 billion losses shared among 200,000 victims. And so the question, people would say, you can't compensate all them. Well, how much money did Josh Frydenberg forgive in JobKeeper overpayments and payments that weren't required? Well, totally, $40 billion. So if they can do that, they can solve this problem with financial victims, and the Australian people need to demand it, because if it hasn't happened to you yet, it will.
But Robbie, the point about that is that's not the full extent of the stupidities and the bad handling. That's just the tip of the iceberg, right? Because as I talk to quite a few people through my surveys and beyond, I get the same stories again and again about the banks essentially not doing the right thing by their customers. There's no real. You can use the complaints department within the bank, but that doesn't really do that much. You can then go through to AFCA, and that doesn't do very much. No. And then there's nothing beyond that, right? So basically, a lot of people just give up, and that's really the problem. We are actually in a situation where the whole structure of the way that the banking engages with its customers is biased in favour of the bank against consultants. It's very hard for individual customers to get, the things that should just be, the normal standard things, right? Yeah. And so the whole concept of holding people to account and compensating them is a complete anathema to the politicians and to the banks.
Yep. Well, and the politicians don't want to, establish precedents here. And of course, I can tell you the banks are a powerful lobby. When we were lobbying for the Glass-Steagall bill in 2018 and going to Parliament, I'd end up going to Parliament once a month on average and talking to members of Parliament about the need to separate the banks in Australia. We had one member of Parliament say to us, the banks are here ahead of you. Their high-powered lobbyists were going around the building telling those having meetings with the same members of Parliament saying, do not support bank separation. Right? They're a very, very powerful lobby.
Yep.
Unfortunately, it's bipartisan influence. The current, I mean, how ridiculous, you know, I was talking earlier about the history of the Commonwealth Bank and the Labor Party building its whole political pedigree around fighting what it called the money power. Well, the current head of the Australian Banking Association is a former Labor Premier, Anna Bligh from Queensland. And she's now there making excuse after excuse after excuse for the banks. And she's there running interference for Josh Frydenberg, whose policies are there to serve the banks, right? It's just outrageous.
Yeah, it's engineered into the very fibre of the way that economics and the society works. That's why it needs to change, because it's not actually fit for purpose. So that's my sort of take up. And I've been working in the banking and the financial sector for years and years and years, and it's been getting worse and worse and worse. And every time there's an inquiry, you know, you throw all of the evidence back into the inquiry, but nothing happens. You know, look at the Royal Commission, right? I mean, the Royal Commission was an amazing revelation as to what we all knew was happening, but crickets in terms of what's changed following. And that's the problem.
It's a huge problem. Now, part of that problem, though, was there was an election just after that Royal Commission, and Bill Shorten ran dead on the banking issue. Labor should have prosecuted the government from one end of the country to the other on that. That said, and Labor's not going to do any better this time around. That said, what the Royal Commission did prove to the Australian people, if they weren't aware of it before, is there was a serious problem in the banking system. And if you, I encourage any of the viewers of this show to do it. Talk to people and say, do you accept there was problems in the banking system based on that Royal Commission? They'll almost all will say yes. Do you think there should have been action taken to clean that up? And almost all will say yes. And then what they need to know is that not only has action not been taken, the government bided its time until it could push it the other way.
Yep.
There was an intent at ASIC to clean it up with Shipton and Crennan. They ambushed them and forced them out. And the most egregious example of the government pushing it the other way was this responsible lending, these responsible lending laws that Josh Frydenberg has fought very hard to water down. Now, this week there was a chance to actually discharge that bill, and it should have been discharged, even though it was probably mostly symbolic. The bill won't pass before the election anyway, and it'll just expire. But this is one that should have been discharged because Justice Hayne had been so clear that these laws must stay. And these laws had been enacted in 2011. They had not or hardly impeded the banks building up the property bubble from 2011 all the way to 2018. They didn't seem to get in the way of much irresponsible lending. They're not very strong, to be honest. There's a few safeguards in there, but not many. So Josh Frydenberg runs this campaign that says they're interfering with an economic recovery, right? And it was just a joke. And it was, but most egregiously, he had said he would implement the recommendations of the Hayne Royal Commission. And this was an example of him going completely against that. And as an aside, remember the look on Hayne's face when he handed over his report to that weasel, right? Because I think he could see the future as to what was going to happen. And the only time someone has looked like that next to a serving Australian politician was Grace Tame at the Australian of the Year. And good on her. And she copped it for being, Jenny said she should have showed better manners. Well, I wonder if Jenny would say that to Justice Hayne from 2019, right? Because he had the same look of contempt on his face for Josh Frydenberg, and so he should have had. And it was borne out. It turned out to be true. But the reason I'm saying what the Australian public would think is because our slogan for our political party is citizens taking responsibility, Martin. Because we don't have the luxury to stomp our feet and say they're not listening to us. The government is a reflection of the people. We have to make, if the system's not working, it's up to us to make it change. And that means more engagement, right? That's why we've come up with all these solutions, etc. We have to recruit the public. You've got to focus on these important issues and recruit the public to them so that it forces the change through one way or the other.
And we've proved with the cash ban and other programs too that when you actually get the wind in the sails and start picking up the phones and start making politicians understand that we understand what they're up to, and we don't like it, it can make things change. Now we're running very close to the end of the show, Robbie, but there were a couple of quick questions. Daniel asked me earlier on about, do we know anything about banks in Australia exposure to Evergrande in China? The short answer is, I don't know what exposures there are because it's not publicly disclosed. None of the banks here in Australia have made any public disclosures. So
but the international creditors of Evergrande have taken a haircut.
Yes,
right.
Correct.
But yeah, that's going to be up to the banks to disclose that. I don't know if when I try and combat anti-China disinformation, Martin, you can see that one of the statistics I've drawn up from the Department of Foreign Affairs website is, as of 2 years ago, there was actually more Australian investment in China, slightly more Australian investment in China than there was Chinese investment in Australia.
I know. And
so the idea that, China's buying us up and, we can't reciprocate. Well, somehow we do reciprocate. So I don't, those investment figures though, I don't know if that would include Australian bank exposure to Evergrande. It may. I don't know how those figures are actually structured. They might be characterised in different ways, but there may be something there. It'll be up to the banks. That's a question you have to ask the banks, and because they're private businesses, they can tell you what they feel like.
But none of the analysts, because I listened to some of the analyst calls over the last few days, none of them asked that question. Interestingly.
That said, don't assume whatever the exposure to Evergrande is any worse than the exposure to the mortgage market here in Australia.
Yeah, that's probably right. That's a bigger risk, right?
Inflation rising, talk of interest rate rising, even the bear, Christopher
Joy.
Is he called Christopher Joy? Because he looks like a bear. Even he said 2 years. When was it? 2 years or 3 years after arguing with John Adams publicly that there wouldn't be a crash, even he now is saying that the inevitable interest rate rises will mean a crash in the property market. And I think they underestimate it all because there's all sorts of layers to this. When they're trying to analyse these things, they regard them as rather contained. Maybe they will be, but they could easily be completely uncontained. Our market has, they kicked the can down the road for so long, they cannot foresee everything that can possibly go wrong. That's why things do go wrong. But, if they can foresee everything, most things wouldn't go wrong. So whatever, all the things they're looking at, the holes in the dike, they run out of fingers after a while, and you can't keep plugging them all. And one of them turns into a big gush, and then suddenly the bank washes away. So yeah, that's the scenario that we could be facing, and it'll, relative to us, it'll be bigger than Evergrande.
Absolutely. And this other question came up from Cookie Boy a couple of times. Your thoughts on the RBA and Phil Lowe. I thought that might be a good place just to draw the conversation to a close, Robbie.
Well, two thoughts. One is talk about not fit for purpose. It's fascinating that New Zealand raised interest rates twice last year, and that's the closest economy and style financial system to us because they're our banks in New Zealand, right? Our banks own their banks. So they raised interest rates twice based on the inflation concern, while our Reserve Bank was in total denial that this was an issue. This year, Phil Lowe has changed his tune and had to acknowledge this is an issue. He's acknowledged that he's foreshadowed interest rate rises in Australia. So the writing's on the wall. But to me, that means that last year he was bullshitting the public, right? This was damage control. This was narrative management. And is that what the governor of your central bank is supposed to do? That's the question. But of course, these central banks are part of a club. The whole Basel Bank for International Settlement system is a club. Basel is the Bank for International Settlements is known as the central banks of central banks. These guys and people like Phil Lowe from the RBA and what's his name, Wayne Byers from APRA, they go and serve their time at Basel before coming back to Australia and running these central banks. So they make their decisions in coordination with that international superstructure that exists above the banking system and above government. And that's the problem we have with all of them. Phil Lowe is the one there at the moment, but they're not there. I do not regard them as having their primary mission is to serve the Australian people. They serve an international financial system, and the stability and what's the word, welfare, I suppose, of that financial system comes first.
Yep.
They'll rationalise that to themselves till the cows come home. That you've got to have that stability because then everything can become chaotic. But I would say, no, we need to have a financial system that actually serves the people, and that's why governments have to get more directly involved and stop letting these supranational institutions dictate to us. And on that note, we have an article in our magazine a few weeks ago, written by my wife, Elisa Barwick, on the RBA and this question, and she was commenting on this phenomenon. Like Senate estimates is this week. And for the last 2 or 3 years, Senate estimates has had this drama where Guy Debelle, never Phil Lowe, but the Deputy Governor, Guy Debelle, has come to the Senate estimates, and you've got Malcolm Roberts, Jared Rennick, and Nick McKim, those 3 senators, and they've lined him up and they've asked him similar questions. But they're trying to get accountability out of the RBA. No one else in Parliament's interested. Those 3 senators are interested. So Senator Malcolm Roberts, of course, One Nation, Nick McKim's a Green, and Jared Rennick's a Liberal from Queensland. They want to get accountability, and more power to them, so they should. But one of the themes is to the RBA, especially in the pandemic crisis, is what can you be doing? You've just created all this money to prop up the banks, $200 billion. Why can't you do that to help out the financial system? And of course, Debelle gives these mealy-mouthed answers, etc. Well, in this article, Elisa identifies that even though the RBA is independent, there is a mechanism in the RBA Act to acknowledge that there could be differences of opinion between the government and the RBA. And if there are differences of opinion, even though the RBA is supposedly independent, that mechanism exists to resolve that disagreement so that the government can give direction to the RBA. And what that means is this government all along could have been saying to the RBA, well, you just invented $200 billion in quantitative easing to prop up these private banks. Let's actually invest in Australia. Let's set up a small business lending division, right? Let's set up a manufacturing lending division, or et cetera. Or you could create the actual bank like we say, but it's the RBA that finances the bank. The bank is a specialised institution that does the actual lending, but the RBA provides the credit for that, right? Let's do that. This government, and this is not the RBA's fault. The RBA is just run by apparatchiks that are part of that system. This is the responsibility of the government. The government cannot hide behind this independence of the RBA to say our hands are tied. No, they're not. They could have been making the RBA do this all along.
Absolutely. And the fact is that I don't think the Reserve Bank is fit for purpose. I don't think the message that it's been propagating is appropriate. Unfortunately, I think people are going to get badly bruised. I was talking to somebody the other day who basically took the RBA on face value, no increases in rates until 2024. So they basically said, well, we'll probably be able to afford that then. And now there's rates rising already, and so they're feeling as though they've been tricked. And the other point I'd make, Robbie, is that the RBA has become highly politicised. So it is not objective and independent. And if you want proof of that, look at the Council of Financial Regulators, where the RBA, the Treasury, APRA, and ASIC, and a couple of other hangers-on all sit around the table and have a bit of a jawbone about what's going on, right? So I'm afraid that there's no such thing about objective and independence of our central bank. And I actually have come to the conclusion that actually central banks are part of the problem, not part of the solution.
Well, that's good, Martin. We came to that conclusion too a long time ago. One of the things, the first thing we discovered was independent. They talk about these institutions being independent. They're never independent. What it means is they're unaccountable, because there's always vested interests that determine the direction of them. And the RBA is the centre of the money power in Australia. Not to get too conspiratorial about it, but it's a quote worth quoting, because when Robert Menzies hated the Commonwealth Bank, he hated Labor. There was a real ideological battle in those days. So when he took over from Chifley, it took him 10 years, but in 59, he took over in 49. In 59, he split the RBA off from the Commonwealth Bank. So you had a separate central bank, and he put it under Nugget Coombs. And Nugget Coombs, some people might remember, he was the longest serving bureaucrat in Australian history or whatever. But Coombs once described himself, he said, "I'm a member of the International Freemasonry of Central Bankers." Now, he didn't mean that as a formal thing. He was describing this club, right? So tell the protesters outside the Parliament that they can add Nugget Coombs to their hit list. But this was a, we bankers, we central bankers, they were like this little secret society, and we serve a certain agenda, and it's not what the Australian people think it is, right? So central banking takes away your sovereignty as a country. We need national banks where the democratic authority is the highest power in the land. And that goes back to that John Curtin quote I said earlier, right? Because at least you can say, oh, yeah, but hang on, politicians will stuff up the financial system. Well, we've all gone through 2008. That doesn't scare me anymore. Private bankers know how to stuff up the financial system even more thoroughly with the kind of gambling they've allowed. At least you have a say in who your government is, right? But under the central banking system, you have no say in the financial system decisions that define your life on a daily basis.
Absolutely. And it's worth remembering, term funding facility, more than $200 billion from the Reserve Bank to our banks, right, at 0. whatever it was percent, ultra cheap money, which basically helped to bolster the bank's profits and help them to be able to buy back their own shares. So another example where essentially the banks got a helping hand from the taxpayer.
Yep. So what are the privatisation of profits, socialisation of losses?
Absolutely. Robbie, I want to say thank you. Now, do you want to, before we go, just touch on Russia, or do you want to leave that for another day?
Well, the only observation I want to make for the viewers who are part of the last live stream that Cookie Boy organised at late notice, was it 2 weeks ago we did that? Yeah. We did that because Russia was supposed to invade the next day. And today, Tuesday the 15th, we're being told Russia's going to invade tomorrow. So for a month, Russia's been about to invade the next day. At a certain point, people, you've got to stop. If the boy's crying wolf, you've got to stop believing him. It's become a joke. Go and look at my Twitter feed if you're on Twitter. This is much more serious. I tweeted today something I regard as very serious, because on that show, I showed you those images of actual Nazis in Ukraine, Martin, and the history of that. Well, today, I think he was set up somewhat, but today Anthony Albanese got up in the Parliament, and what he's trying to do is, the Labor Party are cowards on national security. They're trying to make sure that they can't be wedged from the government and be accused of being soft on national security. So he gets up today and he expresses his solidarity for Ukraine. But he said he actually met with the leader of the Ukrainian Association of Australia, a person who he named, who is actually the current global head of the organisation of Ukrainian nationalists that was started 83 years ago by this Ukrainian Nazi named Stepan Bandera. It's the same organisation, and this is the disinformation that's going around there. We were just our opposition leader was actually able to say that he met yesterday with an organisation with a Nazi pedigree, and no one blinks an eyelid, because We've got Russia and China so demonized in our minds that anybody opposed to them must be good and anything they do must be bad. And that is wrong. It's ignorant and it's dangerous. And if I say much more, you might have to adjust your decibel levels.
Well, I would say to people, if you want to see what Robbie thinks about Russia, just go and look at that earlier show. It's still up there. I have to say, Robbie, you certainly polarised the audience last time. So that's why I sort of tiptoed towards this at the end of the show.
and can I, one quick rant about China. Kimberley Kitching misused and abused parliamentary privilege last night to name that that ASIO is working with the government, desperately trying to turn this into a khaki election to scare you all about a Chinese invasion. So you vote for that Darth Vader creep named Peter Dutton and ignore every abomination that they've visited on us for the last 3 or 4 years. And they think that kind of thing works because they have utter contempt for your intelligence as Australian people. And they've got allies in the Labor Party, and they're all in the pockets of the Brits and the Americans. And the worst is Kimberley Kitching, the same cow who threw Pauline Hanson and Christine Holgate in Australia Post under a bus in order to feed this narrative of Chinese interference in our election like they care. Seriously, we've got tickets on ourselves in this country. She names this Chinese businessman, and she had to do it under parliamentary privilege because the media... The anti-China media have been going this guy for a while, and he sues them in Australian courts, and he wins repeatedly. And the judge, and this is not just because of the power of defamation law, because they have no evidence. This is part of a made-up narrative. His name's Dr. Chow Chak Wing, if she had said it outside, she'd be getting sued, right, and lose her house. She's been sued before and lost her house, by the way, because she's quite loose with the truth, Kimberley Kitching, and she did it again. And so this was the news all day that they said he was identified in Parliament. No, he was named in Parliament. It's not identified. They want people to be suspicious. What they're trying to do is make Australians suspicious of each other, especially if we look different. And that's a grave injustice. This is a McCarthyite atmosphere. It's a grave injustice to the Chinese Australian population. And the Citizens Party, I don't care if no one supports us over it. I don't care if in the opinion polls show that in 3 years, 40% of Australians who are anti-China have been turned to 80%. I don't care. I don't care if we don't get a vote over this. This is one party that's not going to tolerate the evil spectre of McCarthyism rising in Australia and persecuting 1.5 million people because, people with agendas have tried to claim they're disloyal to us. And it's just completely unfair. So we will speak out against that disinformation, and that last night was an example of it.
Well, Robbie, I want to say thank you very much. We could go on to midnight, but we'd better stop. Thanks everybody for their questions. I didn't get them all up, but hopefully we've covered a few important ones. But the key point here is it's worth thinking hard about the financial system. And as the election comes forward, there are some thoughts here that you can throw at your politicians and throw at those who actually might come and knock on your door and ask them some hard questions about banking and finance and regulation, all those things, because it's critical that we actually get some change.
Yep. And appreciate though, Martin, there is traction on this postal bank. Yep. The support is there. We just got to knit it together. This is actually one we can achieve. I've never been more optimistic about a policy. We can achieve this. So you just badger every council person, state parliamentarian, federal parliamentarian, let's get this one up and going.
Absolutely. And just ask everybody, please like this show. It's very important to spread the word. And thank you, Robbie. Really appreciate it. I'll put the links and things to the Citizens Party below if people want to find out more. There's a lot of material that you're very active in social media as well. So, people can find out a lot more about a lot of these issues. And I'm sure we'll be talking again before the May election.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you very much. I'll see you later.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, viewers.
See ya. Bye-bye. So there you go, folks. Long show tonight, but there you go. I hope you found it useful. I will just press this button. The doggy cam's still there. They're now sound asleep. But I thought you might enjoy that for a second. And just to say that next week on my show, I have got Leith Van Onselen coming back on, and we're going to talk about economic shocks Where could they come from? And we'll get into some discussion about interest rate movements and all those sorts of things, because I couldn't answer those questions on the show tonight. We ran out of time. So mark your diaries. We'll see you on the 22nd. And of course, meantime, we'll be putting up live shows, recorded shows every day in between, but the next live show is next Tuesday. So thanks very much for your time this evening. Really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you next time. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.